It's kind of funny that we are back to raw lines of code as a metric for productivity in software. I saw this thing somebody posted about, it was like Paul Graham citing some guy who's like, well, I can do 10,000 lines of code a day. And I mean, first of all, like, not all lines of code are equal. I mean, you think of a line of assembly as like literally like move EAX, whatever. It's like minuscule operations in the CPU kind of a thing. So that, each one of those gets a line, and then a line of C, like anytime you're dealing with memory, you're going to have a lot of boilerplate. Just it just takes more code to just say stuff in C, for example, than it does, not as much as assembly, but and then you've got like other like weird languages like hey, like you've got XSLT where a line of code, it takes a line of code to like do something like express a parameter value, and that's like something that you would stick all on one line. So lines of code vary like in what they're capable of expressing, but like the actual semantic unit is more like an expression or a statement. If your programming language distinguishes between the two, most do, I would say, and some don't. Like Lisp doesn't, for instance. But so like yeah, like a line of code is a kind of a fuzzy thing anyway. But like let's just say like a line of code equals one expression. And like it's interesting to me, for example, that my sort of physical upper bound for programming output is about 1,500 lines in like a object oriented, deals with memory, dynamic type, etc. like language. Take your pick, doesn't really matter. 1,500 lines in a 12-hour day is probably my like maximum. And so like it's interesting to me that it's like if I needed to, like I could produce that much code. And before just like hitting like a physical, just the ability to type kind of a thing. But the question is like, what does that represent? And the way that I would say this is kind of like, what does it take to express an argument? Like, what does it take to write a story, for example? How, when you sort of think of like a novel as like certain number of words, let's say 80,000, it's like, well, I can type 80 words a minute. And so like, if writing a novel was just a matter of typing the words out, then I could write one in, 3 pretty leisurely days, at 80 words a minute or whatever. But the thing is with that is like writing like n lines of code is kind of like saying, well, there was nothing out there in the world that said this, that made these, that expressed this behavior. There was nothing in the world that already existed that told this story. And this is how many, in the case of words for a novel, or like this is how many lines of code it took to express this thing. And then again, like the problem with that is like like the bottleneck is describing like the decisions, making the decisions about like, first of all, just like figuring out what you even need it to say. And then like making all of the decisions, like what am I going to call this thing? And how am I going to organize this? And just like, what is it going to be? Because like, as you write code, the whole point of it is to make it modular so that like n lines of code just becomes a single word, a library call to something. And then, while you're working, you could even, notice regularities in the code and be like, what, like I could just make a thing that deals with this for everything. And then in that case, you're actually removing code because you have compressed it. So the actual like quantity of code it only is a meaningful quantity when you're really like trying to measure a gap between the expression, like what you're capable of expressing like today, right in this instant, to like what you need to be able to express in order to like do whatever outcome that you want. And again, like figuring out like what the outcome that you want is actually most of the work, and like the lines of code that it takes are just whatever that takes. And then so again, it's interesting to think in terms of, you know, just the physical upper bound, like how much you could do possibly if you knew exactly everything that you needed to do, all those decisions were made and you could just bulldoze through it. Sure, going from 1,500 lines to 10,000 is a massive productivity increase, but I just like, I don't think that's what's happening. Rather, what I think what's happening is you're getting things that like repeated, or you're just getting, you know, like the actual expressivity of like what is being expressed is probably, I mean, since it's LLM output, it's probably just like a copy of something that's been, you know, pasticed together from, you know, from ingesting a whole bunch of source code in the training data. And so, yeah, I mean, it's the thing to look at, I think, and I mean, the reason why I've been making tools for this myself is like, what do we want it to do? What we want the code to do is the bottleneck, not the code per se. And I think that what ends up happening is when you're using LLMs to generate code, you're skipping over that part. You're not making those decisions. Like it's, for all intents and purposes, making those decisions. And they may or may not be what you want. And so like where the work is going to shift is like try, and we see this, right? You know, the comparison of LLMs to like an intern, you know, and you're the middle manager, like trying to coax it into getting the outcome that you want, as opposed to just expressing it yourself. And again, like there can still be speed ups because like there are trivial decisions that you have to make in code that are like, I would rather not have to think about. And so like if it was good enough to just go blah and be like, okay, there it is, and it's like, yeah, fine, that's good enough, then that is, again, that is a legitimate productivity improvement. But I guess the point is that I'm trying to make is just looking at raw lines of code has never meant anything meaningful in terms of productivity outside of a very, very, very narrow context. Anyway, gonna finish my coffee.